Thank you. All right. Well, good evening, everybody. And thank you, Julia, for being here.
Oh, thank you for having me.
You're welcome. So I have a list of questions that's way too long. The print is not big enough, so I'm going to try not to look like I'm reading from a book. But basically, why don't we just get started? So, Julia, we know you're from Falmouth. Whoa. And I was curious, how does your being from around here inform your life out in Hollywood?
Well, does that work? Can you hear me? I think you're once a New Englander, always a New Englander. And there are quite a few of us out there. My agent, in fact, happens to be from Andover, which is just a funny coincidence. But I think, I came from a world where I grew up loving books. I didn't know anyone who worked in Hollywood. I didn't know any screenwriters. So my love of writing and words and stories came from this other place, which I think is sometimes a little bit of a difference from some of the other people in my field, and it's kind of a fun calling card. I grew up loving TV and movies, but having no idea what it meant to create those things until probably around college when I started to get more of a sense of it. So I like to think that I come from a certain New Englandish literary background that I think probably informs the way I see things and the way I do what I do.
So when you're out there and there's a large number of New Englanders, does that form any sort of tribal aspect to things?
Definitely. We know what to complain about collectively. We know what to talk ad nauseum about. Like, we're still getting used to the weather, and we love it out there, but we miss home. And yeah, I think it's fun. LA is a city of transplants, and almost everyone is from somewhere else. So when you meet people from a particular part of the world, it's a nice way to connect. Yeah.
So in regards to your kind of finding your calling in screenwriting, can you tell us a little bit more about that evolution from love of books, love of writing, to this career that seems to be taking off at a very rapid ascent?
Oh, thank you. Well, I always loved writing. I was someone who just always sort of knew what I loved to do most. As a kid, I wrote stories, and in high school, I wrote fiction, and in college, I took my first screenwriting class, and I really liked what it did for my writing. I liked being sort of forced out of the, for better or for worse, very internal college fiction that I was writing, and to have to focus on what characters say and what they do, and the rest being up to the audience to interpret was a really juicy creative challenge for me, and I liked that, and I sort of got the itch to keep working in that way, and probably around my junior year of college, I realized, oh God, I really want to do this, and I don't know exactly what that looks like. I want to be a writer in some way, and I don't want to do some other job and dream about writing a novel on the side one day. I really want to try to be a writer. What does that mean? So I took one path, and there are many. I applied to grad school, and I got into USC, and so I moved to LA, and that sort of started my formal sort of training as a screenwriter. And then after that, I worked really hard on focusing on a portfolio of work, which is something that the academic path offers you, is a sabbatical of sorts from the real world where you can focus on your craft and hopefully finish school or whatever period of time you set aside for that kind of pursuit with something that is a sample that you can use, and that's what I did, and then worked as a writer's assistant in television as I was learning about that parallel but very different track too, and found that I really like writing characters and dialogue, which is very much the sort of realm of the TV writer oftentimes. And then there are incredible feature jobs like this one that allow you to tell really human, grounded stories on film as well. But it made sense for me to sort of think of my career as doing a little bit of both. And I guess that's how I sort of got set free in this crazy world.
So when you started as a writer's assistant on Parenthood,
yeah.
and then I think next was Rehabilitation Road?
Oh, I got,
Or Recovery
yeah,
Road, pardon
Recovery
me.
Road, yeah. And I was a writer on Recovery Road, so I got staffed
Yep.
after Parenthood. I had a script that made the rounds that was well-liked, and it was on the blacklist, and then I got staffed on Recovery Road, so that was my first. I'd been in a writer's room before. That was my first writing job on a staff.
So was, because I can kind of see a through line between Parenthood and the subsequent work you've done.
Yeah.
Was that accidental, or did that form who you are now, or did that?
It was the most wonderful, serendipitous thing that I got that job at all, because I loved the show, I loved the writers, and I'd been a fan before I even had sort of an inroad, and I happened to meet someone who was involved with the show, and then like a year later our paths crossed, and I had actually been a writer's assistant on a very short-lived show for a little time before that, which was great because I had the experience then to say, oh, if there's ever anything available, I'd love to have a shot. And they did need a writer's assistant for their final 2 seasons, and so I got that job. But it was pretty magical that it happened to be a show I loved so much and a style of writing that I loved so much, and it just extremely naturalistic and grounded, and a really sort of thoughtful look at family life from these writers who are just known for that. Like that's what they do. And rarer and rarer on network TV, these super sort of down-to-earth, human, heartfelt shows. So that was truly lucky, and also I'm sure informed as I was figuring out what I wanted to do, what that meant. And so that was great.
Yeah. I should interject by saying that to keep you from falling into a lull of sweets and cheese and stuff, if you have any urgent questions and want to participate, we'll also save time at the end, but I'll try to turn around and see that hand coming up. But if something catches your fancy and you want to know more about, please join in. I guess my next question, I'll kind of pivot to the reason we're here.
Sure.
It's Celeste Ng's book. I was reading an interview with her, and she said on getting her book published and on its journey to become a bestseller, she said, writing is like shouting into the world. So when someone shouts back, it's a really big deal. So I was curious how her comments resonate with you as a writer, and also if you could identify the first moment or two when you felt you were being shouted at back.
Wow, that's so beautiful. I love that. I think that's absolutely true, and I imagine even more so for a novelist. There's so much solitary time spent with these characters. I think she worked for years and years on this book before it was published, and you are living in your own reality, hoping that it matters to anyone, and with some little burning ember in you that says, yes, it does. So for that to be confirmed after what is truly like a grueling process. I mean, not there are more grueling jobs, certainly,
Right.
but it can be lonely, it can be frustrating, you can be filled with self-doubt, and it's hard to find the stamina to keep going, especially when maybe no one's taken a chance on you or invested anything in you yet. So it completely resonates, the idea that you get that first little glimmer of recognition. And for me, I remember a moment, I certainly remember earlier moments than this when I was a kid and writing and people recognizing that I had something, but what she's talking about strikes me as professional too. So it makes me think about being in grad school, and I was one of the younger writers in my program, and I was a little bit insecure about what that whole world was about. I was still figuring it out. I'd come from fiction writing. I didn't really have a grasp on the business yet. And I remember a professor taking me aside and saying, like, you're special and you're going to surprise people, and you have to keep doing what you're doing. And he was referencing something specific that I'd done on an exercise, and he was like, it's about characters and dialogue, and that's what you do best. So keep finding the projects that let you do that. And that made me feel really seen, and there's no money attached to that or a sale of anything,
Yeah.
but that was seminal for me.
It's a big moment.
Yeah.
Did working in a writer's room provide that shout back? Like, I'd imagine going from the
Yeah.
solitary existence of you and your keyboard, and then being in a room where you're at least going to be heard, whether they like it or not or whatever. But
It's different. It's true, and you do feel, you are sort of, you're in an environment where you are building something together, and so in a way, there's less at stake. I mean, there's certainly something at stake when you pitch an idea and you wait for that beat of silence, wondering what everyone's going to say in response, and will the showrunner like it, and will it get on the board, or will everyone just move past it like they didn't hear what you said, which does happen. But there's also this sort of collective feeling of grappling together that takes a little bit of that pressure off. I would say, like, when I think about selling my first script that I wrote totally on spec, that wasn't an assignment that I just hoped would be good, and had certainly support and help, and knew that it was worthwhile-ish. But for the marketplace to say, okay, especially when you're not just trying to be a good writer, you're trying to make a living at it too. That was like another moment of nice confirmation.
Yeah. So writing on spec is writing something that hasn't been solicited, right? Okay. About the Celeste Ng book, so first of all, congratulations on the screenplay.
Thanks.
And the fact that it will be produced is pretty
we
extraordinary.
Hope so, yeah.
That's
I mean,
right.
It looks that way.
Fingers crossed.
Yeah.
So I'd read that Celeste Ng wrote 4 drafts of her book. And it wasn't until the final draft that the structure finally came to her. And so this is sort of my putting on my professor cap for a second, and we'll leave it to Julia to fill in all the gaps in expertise. But so books can do things that screenplays can't.
Yeah.
And Celeste Ng's book in particular inhabits the internal lives of her characters in such a brilliant way. But ultimately, show don't tell is the screenwriter's mantra, that we have to see it to understand what's inside. So with everything I never told you, kind of breathing so deeply the internal lives of the characters, from Marilyn to James to Nath to Hannah, I imagine adapting it into a screenplay was particularly challenging. So not to mention that, but it jumps around time at such a dizzying rate that's pretty manageable on the page, because I can go back but on the screen could be something else altogether.
Right.
So with all of that in mind, and thank you for bearing with me, could you tell us a little bit about your process of adapting this script?
Yeah, it was challenging, but I loved the book so much. I'd read the book for fun before I even knew about the possibility of this assignment, and loved it. And it's lyrical, it's nonlinear, it is deeply internal and nuanced and psychologically very complex, which are all reasons I loved it, and are all reasons that it was tricky to make into a movie. But I also did see the movie. When I read it, first of all, one thing that a film needs that a novel can sort of reflect in a different way is a very strong, causal, tense through line. Almost every film has like a propulsive energy to it that is a function of the way that we watch films, that we're captive most of the time, and that it's not something that you take a peek at and can put down and process and come back to later. It has to do with the expectations that audiences who are very savvy, who have seen thousands of films in their lives, have when they sit down to watch a movie. And as delicate as the novel is, it did, to me, have that hook, for lack of a better term. This question of, first of all, what happened to Lydia, and then once we know, who did it and why. And that's a very filmic question. We've all seen plenty of thrillers and detective movies and crime movies, and so that was interesting, because that was a potential spine. And then around that spine, the opportunity to really ask these, frankly, maybe even more interesting psychological questions, not just about what happened, but who are these people? What are the mysteries of this family that brought this to be? That was pretty delicious for me. But I knew I would need to create that sort of through line that was causal, and that had action, that escalated and brought us on a ride in order to build around the portrait of these different characters. So my first sort of order of business, when I decided I was going to have to write a pitch. So basically, in order to get this job, I had to figure out what my take on the material would be in a pretty detailed way. What ultimately came from that was maybe probably a 14-page single-spaced prose document that was me telling the movie to a bunch of producers who would decide if I could write it. And the process of getting there had many steps. So I looked at the book. I remember making a list of all the beats of the book, just so that I could have sort of a macro sense of it.
Could you define beat for our
Yeah.
audience and what?
Oh, God.
I think I know what it means.
Yeah,
but would
yeah.
you
I think
define
I do
your
too. Well, we'll
version of
find
the
out.
beat?
Yeah. In this sense, it was really just every sort of plot move, I would say. Not every single scene, but every single sort of step in the story. And for a screenplay, usually those bullet points, they're pretty connected, and I keep saying causal, meaning like A leads to B leads to C in a way that is very clear. In a novel and in more experimental film, of course, like there's an opportunity to meander a bit more. So I just wanted to see how the book laid out in that way, which helped me to see ways to use the story and the plot, but also by nature of the fact that not only was this book so internal, like in a screenplay you just have less real estate to devote to story. I mean, if I'd adapted the novel scene by scene, it would have been an incredibly long movie. So by looking at the beats of the book, I could see where I could ellipse certain things or streamline certain things or combine different dramatic moments. And that gave me sort of a macro sense of what my structure would be. I knew I wanted to keep the lyrical nature of it. I could think of lots of great films that employ flashbacks to good effect without taking away too much from the tension of the present action, which is really important. So I sort of devised this idea that I could keep this central mystery and then let each character sort of drive a set of flashbacks that answer another question, in a sense letting the mysteries of this family inform the mystery of what happened to Lydia. And then like the more detailed work ended up being finding lots of ways to make the internal external and ways to make nuanced psychological detail that we get in Celeste's beautiful prose to be dramatized in a scene, because the tool that the screenwriter has is the scene, and you can certainly employ voiceover and other techniques to get at more internal stuff, but I really wanted to make this as dramatic and potent as it could be, and I knew that I could, because her novel also has incredible scenes in it and beautiful dialogue and beautiful observations that I knew I could supplant into other scenes. So, for example, finding moments that could fold together to create a dramatic scene, like, gosh, you guys are all familiar with the book. So, when Marilyn has left the family and gone back to school, there's this routine she has of calling home, and she's silent on the end of the phone, and we hear from her pain and suffering. And that's beautiful, by the way, to play on Marilyn, this quiet phone call. Whoever answers in her family, hears her breathing, but doesn't know for sure that it's her. And then we also had this moment where Lydia, as a little girl, finds in Marilyn's cookbook a note about mothers and daughters, and it's the moment where she decides that if her mom comes home, she's going to be good, and she's going to do everything Marilyn asks. And it's we were talking about this earlier today, it's sort of the story kind of hinges on that dramatic decision that is utterly internal in the novel. So I decided to combine those two moments, and when Marilyn calls, we see that she calls, and one day Nathan and Lydia answer, and they don't know for sure, but they suspect it's mom calling. And that's when Lydia grabs the phone and in her little kid, sort of unselfconscious way, makes this statement that, Mom, if it's you, come home and I'll be really good, I promise, but you have to come home though. And we see on Marilyn that just hit her like a train, and that becomes this pledge that then drives us through the rest of the story, because we see Marilyn unknowingly pressuring Lydia to become exactly what she wants her to be. So you have to make little calculations like that, and it's kind of mathematical work sometimes. Yeah.
So, Danette, thank you.
I'm curious now, you created this work, you've worked it, and it's going to go out there, and you talk about these mathematical calculations, and in your mind you know how you want it to play out. Then there's editing, and then there's people's take on it, and then there's a director. And so, are you ready to give some of that up? And what is
Yeah, that's a really sensitive, thoughtful question about
So
my
if-
my experience.
Did everybody hear that question? Essentially, what are you willing to give up, if I summarize? And if I could fold it into my next question, which was somewhat similar, was sort of the opposite, like what did you feel was most crucial to retain? And as you pointed out, like if you write the whole book as a movie, it's probably a 15, 16-hour movie.
Right.
So anyway, to Danette's question.
Okay. Well, that's very savvy of you, because the reality is I, first of all, frankly, have very little control over what happens in production. I mean, to be a screenwriter is to sort of make peace with the fact that you are a part of a process and you have an agreement with the producers in the studio who control the whole thing, really. And that might be for a couple of drafts. That might be for a few more drafts if there is more work required and they want you to do it. But they can decide that a new writer comes on, a director comes on, and he or she wants to rewrite it. They can decide to go in a completely different direction, and it's not always easy, but it's a part of my world. So the answer is I try to write in the most compelling way that I know how to attract a director with a similar vision to the way I see it. And I sometimes wish I could write in a more efficient way, but I have to figure out how every single thing looks. And I almost always write really long drafts and then have to trim them down because I just can't help myself. It's the way that I can reach a greater emotional understanding of what's going on, to know every little thing about a scene and how it looks and what this person's thinking. And so for my own process, I end up writing too much. I end up cutting it way back. And so I do feel like I have this whole body of knowledge in my head. And it's really fun when you get to work with a director to share that too, because a lot of times they're really excited and open to hear what you have to say about certain decisions that ultimately will be theirs. But also, I think it helps me to write visually in that way. And I think it's best for the project when a writer can create not just a blueprint, but a real experience of what the movie will be, so that the director they hire and the actors that respond to it and the editor ultimately, who often will look at the script for different cues, will be very much on the same page. So that is how I reckon with all of that. But it's tough, and it's one of the reasons that a lot of writers end up directing, I think, and I can absolutely see that appeal, that you really do get to be in charge. And it's one of the reasons a lot of writers love TV as well, because in TV, the balance of power is a little bit different. If you're the creator of a series, you generally have a lot of say in how things look, how the director works, the edits. I mean, you get final cut. It's kind of the flip of features where the director's king.
So I guess to pivot to my corollary to Danette's observation, like what would you, I mean, is there any part of your script where you would be willing to, go to the, I mean, I guess it depends, you may not have a mat to go to, but
Right.
would you go to the mat over, there's just moments where you're like this, you described the phone call
Right.
in the cookbook, and those are
Right.
really crucial to the book. I can't imagine them not being in the film.
Right.
But are there any other scenes where you may feel like, oh, this could not make it in, but it really has to?
Yeah.
And what would that be?
Sure. I mean, and there are probably ones that I wouldn't even think of until they're challenged, and then you realize, I mean, it is in the way that the novel sort of hangs together very delicately. I think the script is the same way, and if you pull one thread, potentially the whole thing could come apart. I think that the flashbacks are really important, and it's a good example because that does strike me as something in my experience that could be on the chopping block. Mm-hmm. Because again, with film, the thing that is going to viscerally grab us the most is probably the story with the highest stakes, and that just tends to be the present storyline. Mm-hmm. Because when you look at a love story in the past, it can be complicated and full of conflict and drama and very beautiful. But if you also see this couple in the present, they made it through, no one died, versus a present storyline where your hopes and fears can be really, really engaged. Mm-hmm. But I would argue, and I, by the way, don't ever think this will come up because our producers and studio are wonderful and all on the same page. But if that were the question, because potentially you could maybe not see Marilyn and James falling in love at Harvard, and Marilyn getting pregnant and deciding not to stay in school.
Oh.
But you couldn't, right? Because it's the thing. I mean,
I can't imagine it.
yeah.
I mean,
really
that
can't.
informs her. That informs her.
It's everything.
Every decision she makes
Right.
is based on.
Now, I truly do have wonderful producers on this. Maybe some producer would say, do we ellipse that or get rid of it because it's complicated, but I don't think I'll have that problem. And I do think it's important to not only just hear that story, but to live with them through that story. It's also like the sweet in the bittersweet of their relationship. And so something like that would be an example maybe.
So sort of about the book and this process as well, I think one of the rules of adaptation, if there is one, is that you shouldn't feel obligated to make a facsimile of the original structure-wise or whatever, and partly due to length and partly due to, like, a good cover song is like kind of original in its own thing.
Right.
With that in mind, probably the other rule is that you do need to retain the tones and themes of the original work. And so I was curious what your impression of, having read the book numerous times, I'm sure, what do you feel those tones, themes, and qualities are? I mean, I think we all have our opinions to some degree, but like, or what were the essential essence of the film, the book, I'm sorry, in your mind?
I mean, I think, well, to speak to the adaptation a bit, I think that if you read my script, I consider it an extremely faithful adaptation in that while it makes some different decisions in terms of structure, obviously I couldn't include everything I wanted to include if I'd had unlimited time and space. It's extremely faithful in that the characters are who they are. Their backstories to me, though not every detail is in the script, inform who they are and are as real as possible. And I would like to say, I think that the themes are pretty intact. I mean, that was my goal. My goal was to sculpt it sort of like a block of clay and make it into a viable screenplay in its own right, which required some structural changes, making the ending a little bit more explicit, leaning into the sort of thriller-ish through line, the mystery that drives us, and being more efficient with some of the flashbacks. But I think the questions of identity, of family, of most of all maybe the way that our personal tragedies, our private pain impacts our family, particularly from a parent to a child. The idea that a deferred dream or a great loss or a terrible shame can go on to be foisted upon the next generation unknowingly, and this aching feeling that I got when I read the novel for the first time, that if only these people were talking about these things, maybe all of this could be healed, or if not all of it, some of it, and maybe none of this would have happened, which to me is like the heartbreaking, poignant point. And I also really wanted to maintain the sense of hope, because I think that exists at the end of the novel too, that despite all of the jagged edges of this family, they've come through something and gained a greater understanding of each other and have this family to go on for, and particularly the youngest daughter, Hannah, who kind of, to me, represents a little bit of ray of light and a bit of a chance for them to do it right this time.
I guess related to that thought about adaptation, people get very attached to their bestsellers.
Yeah.
And we've all seen the movie and been disappointed it's not at all like the book. So I think we'll be
me too.
pleased
I
at
hope
the
so.
similarities.
Yeah.
But were you wary Were you wary at all of stepping into that scenario where you're the one carrying the mantle of this reasonably beloved book?
Oh, yeah, and it was beloved by me. I mean, beloved, period, terrifying. To respect and admire a work so much and then have to make it into something else was kind of a scary proposition. But I felt confident that I could while making some strategic and artistic changes, stay true to the essence of what it is, and that it should absolutely be something that a bunch of people get to see. So I felt that way pretty strongly, and then the first time I spoke to Celeste, who was just so supportive and lovely throughout this whole process, she really gave me her blessing, and she loves movies, and she's really unpretentious about loving movies, and understood inherently that it has to be a little bit of a different thing. So that I had a huge weight lifted off my shoulders. But that said, I mean, it still felt like a lot of pressure. And there were times, I mean, I would get so ingrained in my notes on the book and rereading the book and looking at scenes from the book, because there's just an embarrassment of riches, of great little dramatic moments and little touches, and even lines that she's written that I got to steal, which was so cool. Like, there's a description of quiet falling over a room like snow. And I thought, oh, thank you, Celeste, I get to have that. But there were moments when I had to put the book away consciously, because I love it so much and I respect it so much, but I needed to give myself a little bit of a mental leash to discover and play and make it my own, so that I could do justice to the essence of this beautiful thing.
Right. I guess a question I had for a bit later, but I'll ask it now, was what were your interactions with the author like? It's nice to know she was very supportive.
She was great.
You know, she lives in Cambridge, so she must be wonderful.
Yeah.
But like, it's nice that she gave her blessing and gave you the leeway to, but what, like, you know, did she approve you? Did she, like, what was that?
That's a good question.
What's the mechanics and the artistry of it?
Yeah, it varies from project to project. She's not a producer on this project, so she didn't have to approve me per se. And I believe she's a producer on her second novel is being adapted to a series, and I think she's a producer on that, so she probably has a more official role. But everyone just had like the utmost respect for her, so her opinion was very, very important, even though she didn't hear my pitch. Very quickly after I was selected, I got on the phone with her, and she was just lovely and wonderful. And we talked about a few creative questions that she had, and I think I had some questions for her. But it was all very much like, go with God. Let me know if you need anything from me, and feel free to make it your own. And then throughout the process, I might have asked her a question or two, but again, I was so enamored by this book and by Celeste that I sort of had to kind of go into my writing cave and block it out. And then she read a draft and loved it, which was the greatest gift. And
she shouted back at you.
Yeah. So that was very, very special. And she had a couple of ideas, and so for the next draft, I incorporated those, and it was really a dream.
So about adapting the story, and you know, when I read it, in thinking about you writing a script, I was taken aback by how we pivot from the points of view of every single character almost. And in thinking about it, it seems like Marilyn is the character who undergoes the most dramatic transformation. I mean, her identity is shattered and kind of rebuilt towards the end.
Right.
So she seems like the most profound character. I wondered when you were making a choice whether to make it someone's story or everyone's story, and I believe you sort of, Marilyn's the central character.
Yeah.
Did you write it at all that way, just driven solely by story or by its potential for attracting a big name like, say, Julia Roberts or somebody like that?
Yes.
Because it seems like a wonderful role, but it seems like one that could be more wonderful if...
Right.
So could you just tell me about your choices?
Yeah. So certainly she did strike me as maybe the center of the story, in the sense that she does go through this transformation. We get such a full portrait of her, and we get a deep historical portrait of James throughout his life too. But I would also say Marilyn probably has the strongest want in the novel and in the script, in that she, when they find out that Lydia's gone, she decides that, you know, she's been operating around incompetent men her whole life, and she is going to figure out what happened to her daughter. If anyone wants to get in her way, just you know, try to stop her. And so that, it was appealing from a screenplay point of view. And my sense was that it would be great to sort of anchor the story with a protagonist. And it's still very much a shifting point of view. We're alone with James, we're alone with Nath, we are alone with Lydia in sort of omniscient flashbacks. And even with the cops, sometimes we get a little snippet of them. And I tried to be very intentional about the point of view because I hate it when books or movies sort of break their own rules about who we're with and what we're allowed to see and what, that perspective. So but I did like the idea of anchoring it a little bit more in one character, which is what I did. And I think I probably would have made this choice anyway, because the worry with the real estate of the script is that if it's too diffused, you might not attach quite enough to anyone,
Right.
because there's quite a few characters. And then also, it definitely was discussed early on that this would be a very castable part and a fun part for an actress, and maybe a big star. And we're lucky that we have one now, so
Yeah.
that's pretty
So
cool.
that has to be part of the equation to some degree.
Yeah. I can specifically remember it being mentioned that would be the most castable role, which is a practical and a creative, decision to sort of approach it that way. And I have a hunch I probably would have made that
Yeah.
creative decision anyway.
I mean, fortunately, it seems like they're lined up, though.
Yes.
The commerce part of it and the artistry.
And when they're not lined up, it's my job sometimes to push back because it has to be good. It doesn't matter. You're not talking about a big actress if it's not good. So it has to make sense.
Right.
But there are those factors to balance, for sure.
So I want to check in. Does anyone have a burning question? Because I've got 39 more pages of questions. So, no, I'm kidding. We'll be here till 3:30 tomorrow afternoon. Okay, well, I'll continue. You had mentioned thriller and mystery, and it seems like, with genre conventions, we get a set of rules that can help you with structure.
Right.
Now, the book, to me, like the first third or half of it definitely read like a mystery, and it was so compelling until, and it was still compelling after the answers started coming. But did you lean on genre? And I guess maybe you've already hinted at that.
Yeah.
And if so, I hadn't thought of thriller, but I suppose that's certainly has shades of a thriller. But so where did you go with it?
Right.
Did you, what genre or hybrid did you choose and why?
Thriller's probably slightly too strong of a word, and yet maybe that's the best word we have for these really tense, potent adult dramas that involve crime, which is where my head went. And to use the conventions of that genre as sort of a Trojan horse that would let me in and actually tell this relationship drama, essentially, but with this simmering suspense and anxiety kind of in the background that keeps you on the edge of your seat. So I watched a lot of movies in preparation for pitching on this and just in thinking about it. And there are the beautiful sort of domestic dramas that have a bit of a twist to them, like American Beauty or The Ice Storm or Manchester by the Sea, which I would argue operates as a bit of a mystery. Ordinary People operates in that way a little bit. And just a touch of something like that can sort of give it the grit that it might need, for the business, the commercial realities of it all. I mean, when you're writing a screenplay, you're asking someone to write a large check to make this thing a reality. And if by giving them moments that they can stitch together in a trailer that feels pretty exciting and piques your curiosity, as opposed to a family drama that's just about grief and reckoning with the secrets of your past and the resentments that you harbor that are unresolved, one might be a little bit more exciting to more people. And I think, I think you can have it all with a steady hand, with not going too far. I mean, that would be one thing that I wouldn't want to happen, for it to become like some strange Gone Girl knockoff, which again is not the risk because of our team. But you could imagine in the wrong hands going too far in that direction.
And so leaning on a genre, does that tend to help you as a writer?
Yeah.
To figure out where it belongs and then
Yes.
where to veer from our expectations and,
Yes.
and line them up?
I think it's a great tool in our toolbox because I mean, my personal taste, I can really get into a very small story. I don't need much. I would love to write like a scene where people make coffee at the table together and say almost nothing, and we like know their marriage is terrible. But that's that's not exciting to everyone, and I'm constantly looking for ways to push myself to deliver on the commercial promise of some of these stories, the entertainment value of some of these stories, because it's art and it's significant, but it also has to take us on a ride. So I find that to be really helpful, to think about what genre would this be, or could this be? Can I learn anything from those types of films? And then I often will watch a few movies before I begin breaking the structure of a pitch or a new script, and just reminding myself of how they operate gives me ideas.
And so I guess maybe you've already answered this, but what kind of research did you do as a writer to capture, the immigrant experience, 1970s Ohio, in all of its dysfunction? If you've ever been to Ohio, you know it's full of dysfunction. I'm kidding. If anyone's from Ohio, I'm sorry.
Sort of a quiet dysfunction.
Was it just watching films? Was it, frankly, I guess just reading her book, all the research is there?
One of the terrific things about adapting a book that is this fully realized is that you start way ahead of the game in terms of not only a psychological understanding of these people and their struggles, and all these beautiful moments that you get to cherry pick, but a sense of the world. And I thought Celeste wrote about the bristling tension in this town at this moment in time in a really beautiful way. I also knew that the producers didn't want to veer so period piece-esque that it dated it. They saw a timelessness in the book, which I think is true, that we wanted to capture. So
is it still set in the 1970s?
It is, and that was essential. I mean,
Yeah.
that would be impossible to compromise
Right.
on for a lot of reasons. I think maybe it came up at one point, or someone was asking me about this, but I mean, certainly this is a universal story in a lot of ways about roles in a family and male-female dynamics and race. But if Marilyn and James had gotten married at a different time, so much of the strife would have been different. I mean, if Marilyn if the birth control pill had been invented when Marilyn and James got together, or if universities had been aware of the value of diversity, maybe he would have gotten that job at Harvard and they never would have left Boston. You could imagine the whole story unfolding differently.
The stakes are very different.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And Marilyn maybe could have decided, I want to go back to school and I'm going to get a babysitter, and this isn't going to be embarrassing that I'm going back to college at 37. But anyway, we also knew that we didn't want it to be all lava lamps and bell bottoms, that we wanted it to feel timeless. So I definitely watched movies of that era, or set in that era, both. And it's interesting to see how they're different, like the idealization of the 70s versus the movies that were made in the 70s that sometimes don't seem so 70s. And I read and I listened to podcasts, and I bought a photography book and would just look at it for inspiration sometimes.
I'm going to check in now. How are we doing? Any questions? You're good? Yes, sir.
Yeah, I'm kind of interested in how the process works of you being selected.
Sure.
I assume that the rights to the book were purchased by the producer or producers, and they said, okay, we need a screenwriter.
So far, you're right on money.
Do they come just to you? Do they go to different screenwriters and see what they come up with, and then there's a selection process? And after you're selected and you go through all the work and write the screenplay and the script, is there a level of collaboration that you have as the film is being produced and acted out? And do other writers come in and you sit around and talk about making changes? Just
Right.
talk about that.
Yeah, sure.
So if folks, just to summarize, I think I got it. The process of getting in the room to pitch is one thing, and then also once the film is being produced, how much input might you have? Capture the gist-ish,
Yeah.
and then you go with it, Julia.
Well, it's different on every project. On this one in particular, yes, the producers had optioned the book. They'd set it up at a studio, And it was such a popular and I think beloved among many writers as a story. And so it was competitive. And the way that works generally is that they will, I'm sure, field calls when it's announced that the book's been optioned by so-and-so studio from writers who are interested in talking about the project. They also will submit it to writers who they know might have a take on the material. And then the process, probably a few are narrowed down before anyone does any work, but then this process begins that we casually call a bake-off, where writers have to assemble a take and pitch. And the take is, as I kind of mentioned, is a pretty detailed understanding of what the film is going to be. I mean, I have to do it often, and sometimes even when you're the only person that they've come to before you make a deal, they want to make sure that you guys are all on the same page, and especially if there's a director or a star, it's good that everyone knows what they're getting. So you set aside time, you do the work to crack the story, which is a lot of work, and then additionally you have to put it into a form that can be sort of performed verbally, and take the listener on the ride of what the movie would be like, which in this case, I really wanted the job. I knew a lot of other people did too. I also sort of had a sense that I was a bit of an underdog, that they maybe were talking to some bigger writers. So I really wanted to pull out all the stops, and I also just can't seem to find a way to not work this way. Like I have to almost know every scene to tell you the summarized version of the movie, especially with something so, I keep using this word delicate, but that's just the best way I can describe it, where everything hangs together in such a careful way. And I wanted the script to be that way too, and it sort of has to be to accommodate all of these points of view and all of these subtle yet powerful themes that the novel lays bare so well. So I worked on that. I went in and pitched. First you pitch to the producers, then you get notes, you maybe make some adjustments, then you go and pitch to the studio, and that's your audition for the job, basically. So I'm reading off of maybe at that point I'd trimmed it down to a 10 or 11 page, single-spaced prose document that's essentially me telling the story of the movie and why I should be the writer. And then you find out you get the job, it's terrific, you make a deal, you start writing. And the truth is, in terms of my involvement going forward, it's really up to the powers that be. I will absolutely write another draft of this because it's in my contract, and so far so good. Everybody's having a ball. But the reality is they could hire a director who wants to rewrite the script. They could hire a director who wants another writer to rewrite the script, and that could happen. Or it could be me till the end, or in some fantasy world, they could shoot this draft, and there we go. And I have such a lovely relationship with the team on this that I imagine, and the script got Julia, so I think we're in pretty good shape with the script, but you never know. And in terms of production, that all is to be determined too. My hope is that if I stay pretty involved script-wise, even if there is another writer or a director with a really strong point of view, I probably get to visit the set and maybe help. If it's a director with whom I have a really strong relationship who wants to lean on me more, writers can be more involved in that. But this is a bit to the earlier question of the role of the writer in a feature film. My job is very important now, and you do sort of have to hand off the baby at some point to the director. So that will determine quite a bit of what happens next. And they're still figuring out who will direct this.
Do we cover? Great. So, I had I guess connected to that question, writers, it seems, are often told to write what they know. And was there any backlash it seems like you won this absolutely deservingly and through a lot of, work and all that. Was there any pushback at all at you being the writer for an Asian American author, a film about immigrants, experiences that you may share, may not share?
Right.
And could you tell us if there was or wasn't and what your experience with that was?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. I think it's an important thing to talk about right now. And it's really cool that these types of questions are being discussed in Hollywood more now than even like a couple of years ago. Who gets to tell which stories, and how do we choose the right artist to tell a certain story? For me, I connected to this book just as a human being, but I also connected to it because my family has a couple things in common with this family. My younger sister is adopted. She's Chinese American in a family of Caucasian people, and I deeply relate to what it's like to be in a family that looks different, for people to not buy it at first sometimes, to see her face subtle and sometimes overt racism. And so that, and also as an extension of that, like Asian American representation in film and TV is really, really important to me. And the numbers are just abysmal in terms of the type of people who aren't white that we see, the amount of people and then the type of people. Namely, we see white men on film and on TV. So I come at it from that perspective. But that said, like I'm a white person. I don't have that life experience that exactly mirrors what the characters are going through. And all I can do is be transparent about that and be really, really hopeful and excited about the possibility of learning and getting to work with Celeste, who deeply relates to this in a way that I can't. And I think it's important for people to know where they can be incredibly thoughtful and have empathy, but that understanding ends. And that said, I think we should be allowed to write stories that are outside of our life experience if we take that responsibility really seriously. And also the cool thing about a film is that it's not just me, right? It's a team of people, and we have producers from different backgrounds. We haven't hired a director yet. There will be other cast members, and it becomes a very collaborative process. So, I mean, there will be notes from actors of color who join this movie, and that will be really cool, and whatever the director's point of view is will be really interesting. So, but to be honest, like one of the reasons that we thought maybe I was an underdog was the race issue, and I thought, that's, you know what, if I lose, I want to try, and it's a big investment of your time to go up for these bake-offs. And I thought, if I lose to an Asian American writer, cool. If I lose to like an old white guy, I'll be so mad that I didn't try. So I had to try.
That's great.
No offense to any old white men in the audience.
It's all right. I'm on my road and I'm not offended.
No.
Well, yes, question in.
Hi.
You had talked earlier about maybe screenwriters moving into directing so that they can sort of bring their work. And I'm sure there's still all kinds of collaboration within that, but bring it to the screen in the way that you want to. Is that something that you ever see yourself doing?
Yeah, I think about it more and more. I do feel that maybe more so with each year that I get to do this, think cinematically, and it's really exciting to imagine not only working with actors, which would be so much fun, but bringing to life like a vision, like a visual vision. That would be really neat, I think. And I have this process, whether I like it or not, of in my mind realizing so much detail that it does seem potentially worthwhile to be able to see all that detail through. So it's something I think about. I also love writing so much, and sometimes I wonder if I'm happiest working on a scene, even more so than being on set. Sometimes I like just choosing the right word or tweaking the dialogue and that sort of little jolt of electricity you get from doing that. So, but it is definitely something that I think about in the future.
Some more, yeah, I think we'll kind of pivot to questions from you all. So Connie, should we hand out the microphone? Thank you. Rob.
To that end, could you take us inside how you were thinking, the language, capturing the scene where Lydia dies, thinking about the ambiguity,
Right.
thinking about the internal outward, thinking about expressing her attitudes?
Right.
Because you could have read it multiple ways.
Right.
How did you read it? How did you capture it in your scene?
Cool, I'm glad you asked about this, because this was one of the areas that could potentially be the stickiest in translating it to the screen, because it's extremely internal. It's even ambiguous in its, but I had a point of view about the ending, which is that, and I, not to say that anyone's right or wrong, but I did confirm with Celeste that I am right. my reading of the ending was that Lydia was going to live her life in a new way, and that she was going to mark that decision with this ritual, and the ritual was going to be this swim that she believed she would survive. And I also love the fact that if you hold that up to the light, there are some flaws in that logic. Teenage logical flaws, potentially. Maybe some sort of subconscious psychological desire to push the limit and to see what happens. Maybe something darker than that, too. And Celeste and I did speak about this in the beginning, I believe. And I knew that, particularly for the film, while the audience in the book gets the satisfaction of having some understanding, however they perceive it, of what happened, the family doesn't so much. And I can't remember if the producers mentioned that initially, but it was pretty clear early on that we wanted the audience to have catharsis in the film, or else this might just be all too grueling of an exercise. So, but I also liked that that we knew a little bit more than the characters, but we also wanted to see our characters be able to sort of fully move on in a way that, again, the medium of film and the experience of watching film and the sort of accumulated knowledge of how films work mean that we do sort of owe the audience a little bit more of that satisfaction. So what I did was, I tried a couple of different versions of it. In my pitch, I believe that I had decided on a voiceover that would bookend the film, so it would exist in the beginning, and the way I begin is a little bit different than the beginning of the novel. We see Lydia the night before she dies have a fight with Nath that's pretty cryptic, and then we see her alone, sort of having this crushing realization that her whole life is about what other people want, and we don't know what that means until we catch up, see the flashbacks with Jack, understand that she had a fight with Jack that night, and that he basically calls her out on the fact that she doesn't know what she wants, and she lets everyone tell her what to do. And that's before she storms off from him. And then we catch up to her decision to go out on the lake. So what I ultimately decided to do in the script was have a note. So she leaves a note to Jack, an apology, saying, you were right, and that's why I got so angry, and I'm not going to tell anyone your secret, and I'm going to start doing things differently. And I've also threaded through, and it was present in the novel too, but I chose moments to thread through this idea that she hated the water. She had been forced to take swimming lessons as a kid, but it was when Marilyn was gone, and she didn't want to do it, and Mom wouldn't make me. So that it was clear enough to the audience that she believed that she could swim. So it didn't point to an obvious suicide. And I think from the note, we understand that she intends to mark this as a ritual, but she leaves the note on Jack's porch in his rickety porch screen door, and it blows away. And it's the same gust of wind that we've seen at the beginning of the movie, sort of below the curtains in her room when we first realize that she's gone. So I didn't want to, it felt too heavy-handed to sort of let Marilyn and James in on all of that. But what I did give to Marilyn and James via Nath is a little bit of relief that Nath has this theory that he shares with Marilyn at the very end when their relationship's at its most stressed point, that he thinks maybe Lydia was just going for a swim. And it's like, hopefully, it is this sort of beautiful gift to her that he is easing her conscience. Because that's the point in the script when Marilyn is finally starting to acknowledge the fact that maybe this was all her fault. And he says, I don't know, maybe she got the courage to try something new. And Marilyn's so grateful for her son, whether it's true or not, giving her that reprieve.
Yeah, thank you all for the questions, and Julia, thanks for bearing with my book of questions.
Oh, thank you.
And Connie, pardon me, we're going to learn more about what's next, but thank you all for sitting here and listening to our conversation.
A huge round of applause.
Thank you.